So here I have a blackboard filled with information about the current and previous implications of the policy rulings that were put in place including but not only in the educational sector and imposed upon us by the health and safety, the sector of the government. And essentially I'll just go through these notes quickly so that you may have an idea of what I'm trying to assess precisely. And then, so here we have the implications that came along with online learning, or virtual learning, which was imposed upon the population during COVID and the justification used in order to maintain this ruling or imposition was for the safety of the population and to the minimization of the amounts of debts caused by the propagation of the COVID-19 virus. And so we had a massive move from in-class learning to online learning from the population, meaning that most of the students which were studying in the public system and the private system had to take classes online instead of in class. And the implications and the impacts of moving to online are still being understood and measured to this day in regards to a potential lag in the rate of education that was normally expected of a certain group of the population. And so what we saw were policies of security measures, meaning the mask, meaning the distanciation, meaning the hand sanitizers, and policies of quick adaptability in regards to moving from in-class to online, which meant understanding new ways, or maybe preparing a part of the teaching base, not maybe, absolutely preparing part of the teaching base to teach online instead of in class. And so that meant policies and statement in regards to professional development, as well as just remediatory measures for the teachers who were not familiar with the systems of teaching, which were found in the virtual. And so then there's a question of the fact that we are moving out of the COVID-19 period. However, there's still a sense in which we are in a midpoint in its development, where a part of the system still acknowledges the restrictions and the regulations imposed by the policies, whereas another part of the population is starting to disregard the potential health threats which were cause for concern and for immediate governmental action, which was the important part of the COVID-19, was that it was imposed on the population on the basis of health. And not only is that important, it's important because some governments, including the Canadian government, were able to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the basis of their governmental response and their imposition of these policies, which had the security of the population in mind. And so to understand how these policies came to be in education itself is to again refer to the online learning and the continuation of learning in an online environment for multiple months to years of teaching in that way. What does that mean for assessment is another question that the UNICEF tackled, and essentially accessibility and assessment were the two measures which were put on display in regards to understanding equity and equitable treatment, given that education is a social good, a social right, and as such it is deserved by the population, and if it's not properly serviced by the government, then there is an inequity in accessibility again. And so the equity part of it was big because we could see a large difference between the low income and the high income provinces and countries, especially countries. But in that sense, the high income countries, which had a higher rate of accessibility and assessment, whereas the low income countries had a low rate of accessibility and assessment. And so you could imagine that the level of inequity found in the lower income was higher on the basis of inaccessibility of education. And so when we look about this specific graph, it's not about it, but it's precisely a question of looking at it. So if we want to understand the impacts, if COVID was seen as something of great possible potential impact, and impact in this sense means effect on the population. And the projected effects of COVID was that if it was not responded to, it would lead to a massive number of death. And so by way of infection. And so if COVID was measured to be a great impact phenomenon, and in fact was understood to be real, then the only type of action that had to be taken were immediate action, meaning that any policies had to be followed immediately and throughout the period of time where COVID was seen as a greatly impactful phenomenon onto the population. Once it was mediatized, and precisely because a part of the population were reluctant to accept the severity of the reality of the COVID, we had the mediated approach, which meant that once the real was confirmed through evidence and proof, then we had conditional action, which were more precisely the policies. And the policies were just confirming the immediate action, which was reasonable under COVID threat, because COVID was seen and portrayed by immunologists and the entire, a great part of the health sector to be a very dangerous virus. And so as such, the conditional action would be seen as the policies being instated, formed and developed, but also upheld and imposed upon the population. And so if COVID would have been perceived to be low impact, then we would be talking about precisely kind of a mediated action. If it was real, or if it in its real form, as well as it being low impact, then it would be a question of mediation, which is what we're seeing now, in the sense of saying it's still here, but it's not as impactful. So now we're just trying to account for it in reality to the best of our ability. And then if it is in precisely in the mediatized form, we would see passive action or inaction. So we would see, we're accounting for it, but the lowest potential form of accountability, given that it's not an important problem anymore, which could lead to inaction. And so we can all agree that COVID was a X1 and X2, which were immediate action and conditional action. And then we're slowly moving to the mediated and the passive in terms of considerability. And then my finger's in the camera most of the time, but hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about still. And so as I was saying, I think we're at a point where we're talking about the policy formed and developed and then imposed on the population, and if these were justified, and how much did the Canadian population have a capacity to put into question and contest these policies on the basis of saying that they were responding to a problem which was not as severe as portrayed. And so in that sense, we are left with still understanding the true repercussion on education and the education of the new generation, which is precisely in this online learning and then moving back to the classroom after 2 years of online learning. And that'll be seen and measured by academia subsequently to understand the true reality of the impacts, which is where we are now. And so hopefully that video was informational, and I'll leave it there in regards to understanding what I'll be presenting tomorrow in front of my classroom for my master's, which is a class in advanced educational policy. And hopefully I'm doing justice to the complicated policy development process, which has to account for precisely what is real in the matter and what is in need of being acted upon in a mediated amount of time, and precisely immediate, meaning that what is in necessity of being acted upon, necessary.